May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be pleasing to you, O Lord, the one who gives us strength and the one who does deliver us. Amen.
Amen.
Over the past few years, I have been developing a rather remarkable and curious intellectual pursuit. It's called reality television. Pick your poison, pick your channel. Whether it be cupcakes, undercover bosses, brides fighting over dresses or weddings, the lure of watching people kill alligators, families with 18 children, and now understand there's a 19th child coming on the way, so there is yet again another season. Or those who are preparing for the end of the world. I have to sadly admit, I am hooked. This intellectual pursuit of mine is entertainment, it's humorous, and yet there is a sad compulsion to watch the train wreck that is surely coming. I would argue that this intellectual pursuit is part anthropology. At least I would try to make that argument. In middle school, I tried to figure out what I was going to be when I grew up, and so I went to the library, and in the reference section of the library, there were encyclopedias on careers and what you had to do to follow that career, what you had to study. And in middle school, I wanted to be 29 different things, and one stood out, anthropology. Oh boy, that sounds quite interesting. Sounds quite sexy and glamorous to be an anthropologist, to live in Africa or somewhere like that and study human behavior. I've learned since I've been ordained a priest, I don't have to go to Africa to study and observe human behavior. So I've been watching a number of shows, and again, sadly, I've lost track of the number of these shows I've been following. And one came across the channel in the past 2 weeks that I am now zoned in on. She's married to many men. It's a story about polyandry. Now, there are reality shows that film what we know as bigamy or polygamy. We're somewhat familiar with polygamy, and yet this is a show about polyandry. And so I was hooked and fascinated. What in the world is polyandry? There are some places in our world, particularly in the Himalayas, Tibet, parts of Asia, where one woman is married to multiple brothers. Think about that. In our modern, sophisticated, urbane world, where we debate what marriage is, and that's tough enough for us to debate marriage, there are parts in this world, not a whole lot, but there are parts in this world where a single woman is married to 6 brothers. That's difficult for us in our modern world to understand. But there used to be an ancient time, thousands of years ago, particularly if you lived in the desert, and you were a woman, and your husband died, life was very difficult for you. By the way, life was unfortunately very difficult to women in the thousands of years ago, but it was made more difficult if your husband died, leaving you on your own. So that's tough for us to hear. So we come to church this morning, we urbane, educated, modern people, and then we hear this odd, strange story. some people stood up in the temple, stood up in church, much like today, and asked, Rabbi, rector, priest, if a woman marries someone and they die, and then she marries a second and a third and a fourth and a fifth and a sixth, and they all die, and the woman dies, do they make it? Do they go to heaven? Yet the questions that these folks put to Jesus are not pastoral in nature. They're not asking Jesus how to respond to this woman and all the deaths that she's experiencing. Instead, they are trying to put Jesus on the spot. They are trying to trick him. They are trying to stump him. They're not interested in genuine knowledge or wisdom. Instead, they're putting Jesus to the test. They want to argue and embarrass and divide the audience. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine television ads which seek to not elicit wisdom or how to work together, but instead how to complain about the other party? Can you imagine that? This is nothing new. It's been going on for thousands of years. And so one party, called the Sadducees, really didn't believe that there was life after death. And so they tried to put Jesus on the spot and came up with this bizarre story. You probably have had people do that to you, right? They want to find out what you believe in or what you think about something, and they present to you the most outlandish, bizarre story, right? You've all experienced that. And this is what's going on with Jesus. And if it were me, I probably would have reacted very differently than Jesus. I would have acted out of anger and frustration. And I would have told you, that's not reality. Come up with a better question, something that is real. Not some outlandish, bizarre scenario. That's the way I would have responded. Jesus did not. Jesus answered their question. And he answered their question by using their same tricks and tactics. He quoted to them those who would have known the Torah very well, those who prided themselves on knowing the Torah. He actually quoted the Torah back to them. In the age to come, Jesus says, there is no death, but those who attain to the resurrection are equal to the angels. They are indeed children of God. We can watch all sorts of humorous and sad reality shows. We can be intrigued by those. My suspicion, though, is that the reality we are most caught up in is the reality of our own lives and the reality of death and life itself. That is the ultimate reality, is that thing called death. And you can't separate the two. You can't define death without life, nor can you define life without death. And so we are in this mix. It's called life, of trying to figure out what life means, and therefore what does death mean for all of us. If life is movement, physicists tell us that life is movement. Life just keeps going. We know this when women give birth. Life is literally continuing. And physicists tell us that there is no such thing as stillness in this universe. Some physicists tell us that there are as many as 27 dimensions of the universe. Think about that. I grew up learning just about one dimension. But we're now told that there can be as many as 27 dimensions. And we're also told that may not be the end of the story. Yet again, this notion that life continues. So if life is about continuing, death is defined, medically speaking, as when you are quite still. It's medically defined as you are still. So think about that. If physicists tell us that life is movement and the universe continues to go on, I would suggest to all of you that are physicists, some of whom are believers, some of whom are secularists, I would suggest to you that our physicists tell us that there is no such thing as death. Life continues. It's what the sages have been telling us for thousands of years, including the good teacher who was interrupted one day, I'm sure, by a group of people who had an axe to grind. They were not really curious to get information. They were not seeking wisdom. They were not teasing a conversation. Instead, they wanted to put the good teacher to the test. And so they came up with this very bizarre story. A story which you can see on reality television. But they come up with this very bizarre story. This woman married multiple times. Do they all live? Good teacher. Is there a resurrection? Some of our secular people would say that the soul is immortal. They would say that the soul does live on. But I find that not only Christian thought, but I think what Jesus says is not that the soul is immortal. Instead, that the resurrection to new life is based on a God who says that even though we die, God gives life to the dead. Those are two very distinct things. Those who say the soul is immortal, so the soul just kind of continues on. And then Jesus, who suggests to us that the soul lives on because God initiates. God starts life. God creates life. God is in the work of initiating life. We are reminded, of course, every week, almost daily sometimes, of this reality that we know, not the dumb reality television shows, but we know this reality of life and death. This past week, even the past few days, those who live in the Philippines are struggling with life and death. We know this reality so well, even perhaps close to home. That is the reality, beyond the dumb television shows. This reality of what happens when we die. And when a group of folks ask the good teacher, even in a bizarre way, a stupid question, Jesus tells them that resurrection is not based on this thing called a soul that just continues. Resurrection is based on a God. Resurrection is based on a God who says that even though we die, God gives life to those who have died. In the name of that God who gives life, initiates life, invites us to life, in the name of that God, amen.
Amen.